once in a while we're going to take a detour out of the book of Romans to talk about a topic that the book of Romans is speaking about. And as you know, in Romans chapter 1, one of the issues that is spoken of is this issue of homosexuality. Paul calls it indecent acts, that men gave up the natural function to sleep with other men and women did the same. And he says that this is one stage of depravity that ultimately leads into insanity. So we're going to talk about, as we talked about last time, the fact that same-sex marriage is how this issue is manifested in our culture today, and we're going to talk about how there's nothing gay about same-sex marriage, and how same-sex marriage will hurt everyone, and I'll explain what that means here in just a minute. And we're not really going to use the Bible to make our case here, because when you go in the public square, you have to use good reason, and you run into a lot of trouble when you just try and quote Bible verses to people. They're going to give you a number of objections, including the separation of church and state and many other ones. We'll deal with those here tonight, because as you know, last time we talked about this issue, we covered why same-sex marriage should not be endorsed publicly. But let's review very briefly where we were last time. We talked about the question, why should Christians care about this issue? And last time we mentioned that this issue is a very important issue to the moral health of our nation. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a minute. I also want to point out that we will be correct, not politically correct. This will not be an issue, or this will not be a segment where we're going to be talking about gay bashing or any of that. We're just going to try and give good reasons why we think, or why I think anyway, that same-sex marriage ought not be endorsed by the federal or state government. And you'll see why that's the case in just a minute. In fact, last time we were here, we covered these three areas. Actually, we just started with point 1 when we covered why should same-sex marriage, or why should the state endorse traditional marriage, I should say. Why should the state endorse traditional marriage? Some say, you know, the state ought to stay out of marriage at all. It ought to just be in churches or synagogues or whatever that church has done. It ought to just be a religious right, but the government ought not be involved in it. Then secondly, we talked about why should the state not endorse same-sex marriage, and then we briefly talked about the objections. Tonight we're going to spend most of our time in the objections, because we covered points 1 and 2 last time. Let's just review what we did last time. Why should the state endorse traditional marriage? And we pointed out that traditional marriage is our national immune system. When our marriages are strong, our country is strong. When our marriages are weak, our country is weak. And you can look at the weakening of our nation when we basically got rid of traditional marriage and made it much easier for divorce to occur. We've seen a number of social problems that have resulted pretty much as a direct result of liberalizing marriage laws, or making divorce easier to come by. And we pointed out that traditional marriage is really the foundation of a civilized society. The best form of government is a two-parent, mom, dad, family. We pointed this out last time. When you have strong families, you have lower social costs and lower welfare. You have domesticated men. Remember how we talked about how men are predators? Single men are predators. We talked about this last time. So single women, don't trust single men. Because one of the beneficial aspects of traditional marriage is it domesticates men. It also protects women from uncommitted men, because women give up a lot more in a marriage than do men. They're the ones that can bear children. We also talked about how the fact that abortion, child abuse, a number of other issues go away when people live faithfully in traditional marriage. It's the best place to raise children. We talked about how children do better in a two-parent mother-father home, much better than those who are outside of a two-parent home. So it's our national immune system. And then we talked about why should the state not endorse same-sex marriage, and we pointed out this quote from a man who calls himself a liberal Democrat. His name is David Blankenhorn. In 2007, he wrote a book called The Future of Marriage. He says, I'm pro-gay. I think the Bible's wrong about homosexuality, but he says, I cannot be for same-sex marriage. Why? Here's a quote from David Blankenhorn. He says, across history and cultures, marriage's single most fundamental idea is that every child needs a mother and a father. Changing marriage to accommodate same-sex couples would nullify this principle in culture and in law. He's absolutely right. Why? We talked about it last time. There's only three things the government can do on any issue. The first thing it can do is prohibit it. It could prohibit the activity. It could permit the activity, or it could go further and promote the activity. We used the example last time of alcohol. For a while we prohibited alcohol. Now we permitted alcohol use, but we still have restrictions on it, and we don't allow anybody at any time, for any reason, under any circumstances, to use it, because we know it is very lethal. What we don't do as a government is we don't promote it. We don't want people drinking. It causes too much trouble, but we allow it to happen. Now, when it comes to marriage, traditional marriage, we not only permit it, we promote it, because the government wins, and everybody wins when people stay together in traditional two-marriage or traditional two-parent families. What we can't do is promote same-sex marriage. Why not? Because by legalizing same-sex marriage or civil unions, because that's also a promotion of the behavior, we will be promoting behavior that will hurt traditional marriage and children, that it will also hurt you as an individual citizen, and ironically it would hurt homosexuals themselves. Why is it going to hurt traditional marriage and children? Because it will break the link between childbearing and marriage. Because if marriage is just about coupling, if same-sex couples can get married and it's just the same relationship legally and culturally as traditional marriage, then no longer is marriage about children. Marriage is just about coupling, and when marriage is just about coupling, then people no longer get married to have children. But you notice they have children anyway. They have children out of wedlock. There are no illegitimate children, there are only illegitimate parents. And when people have children out of wedlock, they not only break up at higher rates than people who are in marriage, but they create society a whole number of other problems, because now these children are out there and society winds up picking up the tab. Not only in terms of all the social costs and welfare, but also in the costs of crime. And I don't have time to go into the next two about you being hurt and homosexuals. It's on the DVD from last time, so get that. But let's now move on to a couple of quotes we used last time, because I think it sets the tone for what we're trying to do. This is what David Kupelian says about love. He says, "We've forgotten in society what love is, because supporting and justifying homosexuality is not real love any more than glorifying drinking helps the alcoholic, or celebrating smoking helps wipe out lung cancer." He says, "The most loving stance for others to take, for us and others to take, is not to serve as enablers of self-destructive and immoral compulsions, but to stand in patient and firm opposition." We have to stand in patient and firm opposition, just like we do when our children do things that we know are going to hurt them. And then we talked about J. Budziszewski's quote about false compassion. He says, "Real compassion ought to make us visit the prisoner, dry out the alcoholic, help the pregnant girl prepare for the baby, and encourage the young homosexual to live chastely. But how much easier it is to forget the prisoner, give the drunk a drink, send the girl to the abortionist, and tell the kid to just give in." False compassion is a great deal less work than true. And it is. And Christians have been cowards on this issue. We've been hiding under the table while homosexual activists take over and change the culture. And we're just hiding under the table saying, well, it's much more compassionate just to say, it's all about love, go ahead. Well, it's not all about love, and we'll explain that a little bit later. All right? Now, let's answer all the objections if we can, and here are some of the objections. We want equal rights. Don't put discrimination in the Constitution, because there's a constitutional amendment that's out there to try and ban same-sex marriage. Homosexuality is like race. Homosexuals were born that way. Homosexuals can't change. Some animals engage in the behavior. Opposing same-sex marriage is like opposing interracial marriage. Opposing same-sex marriage is bigotry. You've heard these. Same-sex marriage is about love. Homosexual couples have been together for years, so that proves that we ought to make it universal. Same-sex or some marriages do not produce children. You've already ruined marriage through divorce. And why are you singling out homosexuality? Why don't you talk about divorce and adultery and all those other things you Christians do? You know, you ought not judge anyway. And by the way, you're just a homophobe. You'll get that, right? And then the big one that's thrown out a lot is this is a separation of church and state issue, and you Christians are trying to impose your religion on us, and you know that that can't be done according to the First Amendment. Right? Problem for you. See, because I am originally from Jersey, and I speak at 150 words a minute with gusts of 350. Okay? So you're not going to be able to keep up, and sorry out there in TV land and on the web, you're not going to be able to keep up anyway, but I want to point out that there are resources you can get on the web right now that cover most of what I'm going to talk about. Here are a number of places you can go to get information on this issue. Crossexamine.org, that's our website. If you go there, you can get information on this issue. Other places you can go are frc.org, americansfortruth.org, allianceformarriage.org, that's the one I was talking about last week that Matt Daniels runs, str.org, that's for Stand to Reason, coalitionofconscience.org, that's actually one here in Charlotte, North Carolina, run by Michael Brown, the Reverend Michael Brown, very good organization, and our other organization is called impactapologetics.com. The two bookends, crossexamine.org and impactapologetics.com, if you go to either one of those sites and click on resources, you can get a free download of the Case Against Same-Sex Marriage Without Using the Bible. Okay, it's a PDF, and it has most of what I'm going to talk about here in it. Okay, so make a note of that. Go to, it's really on the Impact site, impactapologetics.com, but you can get there through crossexamine.org, and you can download this PDF and have most of what I'm going to talk about here tonight and last week, okay? You guys ready to go? All right, let's deal with this, you're trying to impose your religion on me, okay? This is the separation of church and state objection. First of all, can anyone in here quote the First Amendment? What does the First Amendment say? Anyone? To the United States Constitution. This is known as the interactive portion of the program. What is the First Amendment? What does it say? There won't be a state-established church, someone says. Survey said? And that's not what it says. What does it say?
Congress will make no laws regarding the establishment of religion.
All right, you're getting close. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Did anyone hear the word separation, church and state in there anywhere? No. The separation of church and state came into our law through a court decision in 1947, the Everson Court, where they pulled a quote from an old Thomas Jefferson letter and put it into a Supreme Court opinion. And from that point on, we thought the church and the state are to be completely separate. You can read all about it in the book Legislating Morality, also available at impactapologetics.com. But that's not even the issue. Forget separation of church and state for a minute. We can debunk that, but let's just forget it for a minute. Let's point out that morality, not religion, is being legislated. See, religion has to do with our duty to God. Separation of church and state is not the issue. The issue is not religion, but morality. Religion has to do with our duty to God, but morality has to do with our duty to one another. Nobody in this debate is telling anybody how, when, where, if to worship. Right? I'm not trying to tell people who think that they're involved in homosexual activity that they ought to go to a particular church or worship in a certain way. That's not the point here. We're not talking about religion. We're talking about morality. Religion's our duty to God. Morality's our duty to one another. And I've got news for you. You've heard it how many times? You can't legislate morality, right? That is the only thing you can legislate. Think about it. Every law declares one behavior right and the opposite behavior wrong. That's what morality is, right and wrong. Not only can you legislate morality, all laws legislate morality, the only question is whose morality will you legislate? On the issue of same-sex marriage, homosexual activists want to impose morality on you. What morality do they want to impose? They want to say that this particular activity ought to be endorsed by the federal or state governments and or both. It's usually a state issue when it comes to marriage. And they want tax dollar benefits to pay for it. When two homosexuals get married, your state government revenue is going to go to benefit them. That's an imposition of morality. They say they ought to have that. That's a moral position. See? So they're trying to impose morality just like everybody else. The only question is, what's the right morality to impose? All laws legislate morality. Second point. Some churches are against same-sex marriage, but that doesn't preclude civil laws against it. Otherwise, we couldn't have laws against murder, rape, theft. You say, well, it's in the Bible that homosexuality is a problem, right? That might be true. But it's also in the Bible that murder is a problem, that theft is a problem, that rape is a problem. In fact, if you can't legislate principles consistent with the Bible, then we can't have laws against murder, rape, theft, or anything else the Bible talks about. Just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean you can't have a law that speaks to that issue. So the main point here is religion does not equal morality. Are the two related? Well, of course. But you don't have to get into religion to talk on this issue. Final point on this. If this were a valid objection to separation of church and state, then we couldn't legalize same-sex marriage because there are some churches that actually endorse it. Right? I mean, there are churches out there that say, yeah, come on in, we'll ordain you and we'll marry you too. So if this was a valid objection, then the same-sex marriage activists couldn't use it because it would wipe out their don't like their choices and thus position as well. So it's not a matter of religion, it's a matter of morality. What about equal rights? I've got news again. Everybody has the same right to get married. The law applies equally to everybody, but there are restrictions that everybody has to live up to. You have to live up to them, I have to live up to them, everybody has to live up to them. You have to marry somebody qualified from the opposite sex. Everyone has equal rights. The right to marry the opposite sex. Homosexuals, they want special rights. They want the special right to marry somebody of the same sex. I don't have that right either. In fact, if we grant special rights for homosexuals, on what grounds can we deny special rights to consenting adults who desire to engage in other socially destructive behavior, such as polygamy or incest? One homosexual activist who was confronted with this objection said, on what grounds can you say you want same-sex marriage, but you can't allow polygamy or incest? She says, well, I'm just against those. In fact, I mean, it's just arbitrary at that point. I had a discussion once with a homosexual activist here in Charlotte. He said, I can do whatever I want as long as I don't hurt somebody else. I said, even if that were true, how do you know what hurt means? Does hurt just mean, does it mean physical? What about economic? What about emotional? What about spiritual? What about those other hurts things? But let's leave that aside for a second. You're saying that you can do whatever you want if you're a consenting adult and the other person's a consenting adult. He said, yes. I said, okay, question. What if you consented to have sex and so did your mother? You had sex with your mother. Would that be okay? And he stopped and his upper lip quivered a little bit and he said, yes. Well, he had to say yes. Why? In order to be consistent with his position, he had to say yes. But logically, he knew that the moral law was written on his heart, and that's why his upper lip was quivering. He's going, no, this isn't right, but I have to say yes. Suppress the truth in unrighteousness, Romans 1. Suppress the truth because you want to do something you know you ought not do. Everyone has the same right to form relationships, but no one has a right to have the relationship endorsed by the state. Just because you have a desire to do something, that doesn't mean that the state has to recognize it as a right. You know, people can get married who are homosexuals right now. I mean, 2 men or 2 women can get married. It happens all the time. It's a whole cottage industry. There's gay weddings that happen all the time. What they don't have is state endorsement. They can go do it if they want to, if they want to have a commitment to one another, they do it all the time. But there's no provision in the law for the state to say, we're going to give you benefits because of it. That's what they want. They don't want tolerance, they want endorsement. We talked about why last time, because that will legitimize homosexuality. Now what about sexuals like being black? Any of you African Americans here should jump on this one quickly because it's not the same thing. Why not? Because sexual behavior is always a choice, race never is. You'll find many former homosexuals, you'll never find a former African American. Except, of course, from Michael Jackson, but he's had surgery. Okay, there's a different standard there. But what's the point? The point is that race is never a choice, but sexual behavior always is. Also, gender and ethnicity are not the same as feelings or behavior. Committing homosexual acts is harmful, but gender or skin color is not. You don't harm anybody by having a certain skin color. It's not the same as behavior. But you can harm people when you engage in sexual behavior that is unhealthy and spreads disease, as I talked about last time. Still, in this country, in 2005, there were 160 people who contracted AIDS via blood transfusions. You say, oh, we got that problem solved. No, we don't. And we talked about all the increases in medical insurance premiums that we're all paying right now because of behavior that is medically destructive. How about we were born that way? This is sort of their trump card, the folks who argue for same-sex marriage. We were born this way, and therefore you need to endorse what we do. First of all, before I get into the response here, notice that this objection assumes that there's a certain design to life, right? And if you're born a certain way, maybe by God you're given that desire, then you ought to act on it. In other words, the assumption is that there's some sort of design to this, and since there's a design to it, it's right to do. Of course, what they deny is the design of their own bodies, which, as we talked about last time, the plumbing just does not work here. That should tell us something. So they're looking for design in terms of feelings, but they deny design in terms of anatomy. That's inconsistent. But let's talk about this question. We were born that way. My first question for someone who says that is how? How? How did this genetic trait get passed on to you? Did you have homosexual parents? I mean, think about it for a minute. Really. If there is some sort of genetic component to this, how is it passed on? You think it would have been wiped out a long time ago. If you're certainly an evolutionist, that should have been wiped out a long time ago by natural selection, right? If you're not an evolutionist, it still should have been wiped out. So I don't know how this happens, if it does. Of course, all the medical research into this doesn't show any genetic angle to it. They show much more of a genetic connection to the propensity to alcoholism than they do homosexuality. But we never say to alcoholics, you know, since you're born with it, you ought to go do it. You ought to go do more of it. Of course not. We know it's destructive. Really, the question, nature or nurture, is irrelevant. Behavior, not desire, is the issue. I have all sorts of desires I ought not act on, and I think maybe I'm born with them, but I ought not act on them. In fact, we're all born with a desire or an orientation to behave badly. From a theological perspective, this is called depravity. We're all depraved. We all have things that we struggle with. And we don't know where these desires come from, but we know they're there. And the worst thing we can do is take a desire we know that is destructive if we act on it and put it into the law as something the government ought to promote. And that's what the same-sex marriage people want to do. Desires, whatever their source, do not excuse behavior. Suppose I were to say that I had an inborn desire from the moment I was born to bash gays. Do you think the gay community would say, hey, you know, it's okay since you were born that way, you ought to bash me? You ought to bash gays. No, you'd say, hey, there's a problem here. I don't care how you were born with it, or if you were born with it. It's an illegitimate behavior regardless of where the desire came from. In fact, we have a word that describes what the principled restraint of destructive desires is. You know what that word is? The word is civilization. We all have to restrain ourselves. As C.S. Lewis said, if you're going to have any success in this world, quite a lot of restraint is going to be necessary. Do you notice that? Imagine if you acted on every urge or whim or desire you ever had. You would be dead already. Because we are bent toward evil. We're bent toward sin. We're bent toward selfishness. We're bent toward things that get us in trouble. If you don't think so, I want to ask yourself one question. Is it easy to be bad, or is it easy to be good? Bad. It's much easier to be bad. Well, the lady up front said, bad! With emphasis. That's right. It's much easier to be bad than it is good. It's hard. That's why, for people out there who are struggling with this issue, I don't mean to hammer you on it, because I struggle with things too. I'm just trying to point out the worst thing you can do is to take the desire which causes pain and medical destruction, emotional destruction, social destruction, and try and suppress all the truth about that and put it up as some sort of thing that everybody ought to do. Going back to the scriptures in Romans 1, Paul says this is exactly what happens, that people not only do these things, they encourage others to do them as well. How about, here's a counter question to ask people who come up with this. Sometimes you don't have to know any of this stuff, you just ask a question. In fact, that's a good tactic Jesus used. Of course, he knew the answer, but he always wound up asking questions, didn't he? Here's a question to ask somebody who comes up with the objection, well, we were born this way. I have this desire from birth. Here's the question to ask. Should human beings act on every feeling or desire they have, regardless of where they come from? They can't answer yes. Because if they answer yes, you could say, I got a feeling right now to punch you right in the mouth. By the way, that's not a Christian tactic. It's not endorsed by the, no. The point is that no. I don't care where your desires come from. there are many of them you ought not act on. What if they say, God made me this way? My answer to that is no, God made you a male or a female. He did not make you a homosexual or a heterosexual. In fact, there are no homosexuals or heterosexuals. There are just men and women. What we decide to do with our sexual organs is a choice. It's always a choice. You don't have to engage in any sexual behavior at all. You make a choice. You might also ask this, is God responsible for every desire you have? If so, then God wants us to do evil because we all have desires to do evil, don't we? So obviously, all desires don't come directly from God. Evil desires are due to a fallen world. And if God designed you with these desires, you might ask him, then why didn't he design you with the right sexual equipment? Is God somehow missing it? Is he only halfway a designer where he gives you the wrong sexual equipment but the right desire? That wouldn't make any sense. Now, what if they turn it around on you and say, well, you're born a heterosexual? Because a lot of times they'll say that. Look, I'm saying I was born a homosexual, and you're going to tell me that you were born a heterosexual, so maybe why can't I be born a homosexual? When someone asks me that question, I say, no, I was born a male. Again, I don't know where my desires came from. Also, there are no homosexuals or heterosexuals as a class. Those are behaviors. But if somebody asks me, did I have my desires from birth, my heterosexual desires, my answer would be, I don't remember, but I was born in bed with a lady. And there she is, right over there. I was born in bed with that lady right over there. There's my mom. Hi, Mom. Sorry, I couldn't help it. Felt like I had to be close to my mom when I was born. But based on our design, I think heterosexual desires are normal. Right? Would seem to make that most people have heterosexual desires. Seems to be normal based on the anatomy we have, of course. But does that mean there aren't people who may have been born with desires that are not heterosexual? Maybe that is the case, but again, that's not the issue. In fact, in this fallen world, some people are born with conditions or characteristics that are not normal and may actually lead to harm. Can you think of any? What's that? Sociopaths. Maybe born. Sociopaths actually know right from wrong, but they don't feel guilt. Some people are born with anger. They may have been born just angry. Does that make assault okay for them? Some people are born with medical conditions. Spina bifida. Or cystic fibrosis. Or some sort of mental deficiency. That does not mean that they ought to engage in behavior that worsens those conditions. Right? In fact, what we never do is pretend that those conditions are normal, nor do we endorse harmful behaviors that may flow from those conditions. If I'm born with a propensity toward anger, I am not exonerated when I punch somebody in the mouth. And we never say, you know, because you do have that desire, inborn, wherever it came from, whether it's inborn, whether it's nature or nurture, you ought to go be angry and you ought to go be violent. We never say that. Why do we say it when it comes to homosexual activity? Well, because it's about love. No, not really. We'll talk about it in a minute. Homosexuals want to endorse harmful desires and behavior. Remember, there's only three things the state can do. Prohibit it, permit it, or promote it. They want us to promote it. This is one that is a serious argument that homosexuals bring up. Some animals do it. In fact, I've seen some arguments, they say a quarter or a third of animals actually sometimes engage in homosexual behavior. And this is supposed to tell us that this is what we ought to do. Here's my response to that. Yes, and some animals eat their young too. Should we do that as well? I mean, think about it. If we're going to use animals as our moral standard, then we're in big trouble. When homosexual activists appeal to animals as their moral standard, what does that say about their own behavior? They have to look down into the animal kingdom in order to get an example. We ought not use the animal kingdom as our standard. It's because of the very fact that we're not animals that we make moral decisions. Animals aren't moral. I know you may think they are when your dog leaves a present on your rug, that he's evil. But he's not really evil. He doesn't have a moral capacity to make those choices. You can train him not to do that, but he's not evil. How about opposing homosexual marriage is like opposing interracial marriage? This is my friend Derwin Gray with his wife Vicky. So if I want to oppose same-sex marriage, it would be like me opposing Derwin and Vicky getting married. Is that the case? No. Why not? Because ethnicity or skin color is irrelevant to coupling. Gender is essential. By the way, there's only one race, the human race. There are different ethnic groups based on our skin color, but we're all equally human and we can interbreed, can't we? Doesn't matter you're black, white, yellow, red, whatever. You can interbreed with somebody from another color. Can't you? Of course. But you can't interbreed with somebody of the same gender. In fact, opposition to interracial or interethnic marriage is without merit. Men and women are designed for one another, so interethnic couplings are helpful. But same-sex couplings go against the natural design, and that's why they are harmful. So we talked about last time, just imagine, particularly male homosexual intercourse, not meant to happen. The plumbing and the organs involved, not meant to go together. The organ designed to propagate life is not meant to go into the organ meant to expel death. How about don't put discrimination in the Constitution? Too late, it's already there. In fact, all laws discriminate. But it's not discrimination against persons, but discrimination against behaviors. And it's with cause. It's not arbitrary. All laws discriminate, but they discriminate against behaviors, not people. Example, the First Amendment discriminates against Muslims establishing a religion in this nation, but it does not discriminate against Muslims as persons. It just discriminates against them in terms of what they do, their behavior. It doesn't discriminate against them as people. They can practice their religion just like everybody else until they try and impose it through some sort of Sharia law on the United States. Same thing is true when it comes to the 13th Amendment, which discriminates against businessmen taking slaves, but it does not discriminate against businessmen as persons. 13th Amendment wiped out slavery in the United States. We're not discriminating against businessmen by having a 13th Amendment, but we are discriminating against them if they try and take somebody as a slave. We're discriminating against the behavior of taking somebody as a slave. In fact, likewise, our marriage laws discriminate against the desired behaviors of homosexuals, polygamists, bigamists, adulterers, and the incestuous among us, but they do not discriminate against those individuals as persons. They're discriminating against behavior, and that's what all laws do. By the way, we are not classified by our feelings, our behaviors. We are male and female. We are not homo and heterosexuals. What they're trying to do is they're trying to say they're a special class of people, as if feelings or behavior make them a special class of people. They are not a special class of people. They're male or female. That's it. Oh, it's bigotry to prevent same-sex marriage. That's what they'll say. It's bigotry. What's the response to that? What is bigotry, by the way? That is opposing something or someone without proper justification, right? Without checking it out, you just say no. Now, have we been checking it out here? Are we giving good reasons, hopefully? Of course. So, no, it's sound judgment based on the evidence that same-sex marriage would be harmful, but traditional marriage is healthy and helpful. Notice, by the way, that the argument, like others, assumes a moral standard. When they say it's bigotry, they're assuming there's something wrong with bigotry. They know there's something wrong with bigotry. Homosexuals acknowledge that bigotry violates the moral law, but why don't they admit the same when it comes to homosexual behavior? See, they conveniently use the moral law, the standard of rightness that is written on our heart. They conveniently use it when they think it's to their advantage. But they suppress it. They ignore it when it convicts them. When it convicts them of the behavior they're engaged in. They know in their hearts that same-sex relationships are not healthy. They're not moral. They're certainly not on the par with a man and a woman. Why don't they allow the moral law to tell them that? Because that gets in the way of what they want to do. But they'll whip out the moral law on you and say, you're being a bigot, even though you're not. Well, what's wrong with bigotry? Where do you get that from? A standard? Well, why don't you live up to that standard when it comes to same-sex behavior? Well, you're just a homophobe. And if you're real snappy, you can say, well, you're just a heterophobe. But that's not getting you anywhere. Right? Here's the way you can answer that. You might ask the question, how did you come to that conclusion? And when people start calling you names in an argument, what does that mean? That they don't have any evidence. That they're trying to shout you down. They're trying to tar you instead of dealing with your argument. And they're trying to win the argument by what is called an ad hominem attack. It's an attack on the person. It's not an attack on the argument. So if you make a really good argument and I say, well, you're just a jerk, well, I guess that solves it then. I win, right? No. I have to deal with your argument. Now, why is homophobia wrong, you might ask? Turn it back on it. Well, why is homophobia wrong? Well, it just is. Why? What standard are you using? And by the way, did you ever notice that some phobias are justified? How many people in here have a phobia against snakes? Why? Because they're icky. I like that. Well, there's a moral, there's kind of an ick thing to snakes. But phobias against snakes are justified. Why? Because snakes can't hurt you. It's good to be afraid of snakes, right? It's good to be afraid of snakes or big dogs not on a leash with showing their teeth. It's good to be afraid of that. Well, some phobias are justified, and homosexuality is unhealthy and socially destructive. If I'm a parent, I don't want my kid getting involved in this behavior. Do you? Why not? Well, forget grandkids for a second. That's just, you're not going to get those. But what does it do to people? It destroys them. It really does. Oh, I know somebody who's... We'll get there. I know somebody who's been living in it for years. We'll get there. Hold on. But generally, as we talked about last time, the medical evidence shows it destroys them. Social dysfunction. It is not a lifestyle that is advantageous to good health. Certainly not good health. Certainly not good spiritual health either. And labeling me as irrelevant, why are my arguments wrong? That's the question. Don't call me a homophobe. Deal with the arguments. How about, well, it's about love. Here's the big one. They always say, well, this is about love, and that's why you ought to endorse it. In same-sex relationships, here's the answer. Even if it is, so what? Marriage is state-sanctioned because of its social benefits, not to recognize love. When you go for a marriage license, the person down at the courthouse doesn't say, now, do you really love him? Do you really? And you, do you really love her? They don't care. That's not why there's marriage. Why is there marriage? Because of all the benefits we went through last time. Benefits to society, benefits to the community, benefits to the kids that are birthed as a result of it. Love is not the issue. In fact, most marriages in the world have nothing to do with love, the kind of love we think about like, oh, is she hot? Or, wow, I really like her, or I really like him. It has nothing to do with that. Most marriages in the world are arranged. I'm not saying we ought to do that here. I'm just saying that they arrange marriages because the parents know what's best for the kids. And, by the way, arranged marriages seem to do better than when we decide we're going to marry somebody because of these feelings we have. You notice that? The parents seem to know better. Divorce rate is not quite as high in areas that have arranged marriages. But secondly, it's not about love. What's loving about medically dangerous behavior? What's loving about it? Love seeks the ultimate good of the loved one. Homosexual behavior does the opposite. If you really love somebody, you would not have homosexual intercourse with them. Because it's not helping them. It is not healthy. It's medically dangerous, as we pointed out last time. In fact, most sexual contact that occurs in society is unloving. Think about it. There's a lot of sexual contact going on between parents and kids. Unloving. Between spouses and extramarital affairs. Unloving. Outside of marriage, you may think it's loving. It's not. If you really love somebody, you'd commit to them. Most sexual contact that occurs in society is unloving. In fact, there is some sexual contact inside a traditional marriage that's unloving. For example, when it's medically dangerous, when somebody's injured or hurt, it's unloving. And think about it this way. What if you sexualized every relationship you had? Think about people you love. In your family, your friends. You love all these people, right? What if you sexualized every relationship you had? What would happen? It would be a disaster. Sex is meant to be channeled into a very narrow window, a very narrow channel between a man and a woman inside of marriage at the right time. It's not meant to be outside of it. When that happens, it's like fire. It's got to be in a fireplace. If it gets into the rest of your house, it destroys everything. That's what sex does if it's not in the fireplace. Most of our loving relationships are non-sexual. But there are healthy, long-term same-sex couples. I hate to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. I don't know about you, but when I look at that picture, I get the cooties. Okay? That is the moral law rising up in us. There's something, when you look at that, you go, there's something not right about that. The moral intuition you have is true. First of all, the data show that they are the exception rather than the rule, and laws must be based on the rule, not the exception. You hear this all the time in Congress. Congress people are notorious for doing that. They come up with one exception and they try and create a whole law around the exception. Exceptions make bad laws. If we had to base our laws on exceptions, we would have to endorse smoking because some smokers outlive non-smokers. You notice that? I mean, you could be the total athlete, you could be working out every day, and then you might drop dead, and the guy living next door who's been a couch potato and smoking filterless Camels for his whole life outlives you. So therefore, we ought to endorse smoking. No! It's the exception rather than the rule. Also, we would have to endorse drunk driving because some drunk drivers don't hurt anyone. It's true, right? We all go, no, that's not right. Yeah, it's not right. And so we ought not endorse same-sex marriage because you might find a couple somewhere that seems to be doing okay, at least externally anyway, and has been together for a long time, and they don't seem to be hurting anybody. Seem, I said. So we ought to create an entire social policy about the exceptions? No. Well, you keep talking about how marriage has to do with children, but you know, some marriages don't produce children. So if marriage is about children, you ought not let a man and a woman get married unless they're going to have children, which means all you old folk who are going to get married can't get married, and if you're sterile, you can't get married either. Let's be consistent here, right? Answer. Again, they are the exception rather than the rule, but the rule is that no same-sex couple can procreate. There are no exceptions to that. Not in the natural way, anyway. Also, childless traditional marriage can provide a mom and a dad to adopted children, and some have children from previous relationships. And childless traditional marriages still affirm what is generally a procreative relationship. When you see a man and a woman together, that affirms a procreative relationship. It does not if you see a man and a man or a woman and a woman. And of course, it's not going to be the state's business to try and figure out whether someone's sterile or not, or whether they can have kids or not. They just say, we're going to endorse marriage all around, and if they have kids, great. If they don't, that's okay too. So their objection, the same-sex marriage people's objection, fails. What about divorce? You Christians, you keep talking about same-sex marriage out there, and your own closet is full of skeletons. Divorce. And you know what? They're absolutely right. Do you hear a lot of sermons on divorce? You should. Problem is, a lot of people would clear out and not give their money then, right? But God says, I hate divorce. Why do you think God hates divorce? Because first of all, it illustrates the relationship that He has with the church. But secondly, because He knows of the disastrous consequences it has on the two people who get divorced, and more importantly, the kids. So yeah, we can plead guilty to that. We've failed when it comes to marriage. And we ought to do everything we can to keep our marriages together and to live in a true Christian marriage. We've degraded marriage by liberalizing divorce laws, we agree, but that's not an argument for same-sex marriage. In fact, it's an argument against it. Why? Because it shows that the vast social problems from the weakening of marriage laws through divorce show us how important the law is to the health of the family and the nation, and why we should not weaken marriage further by legalizing same-sex marriage. In other words, when we changed the law like we did back in the 60s, we actually got terrible results in the generations that followed, the 40 or 50 years that's followed. The law does affect our health, and that's why we ought not change the law to elevate same-sex relationships to that of traditional relationships. The law will create a problem if we do that. What we ought to do is strengthen our marriage laws, make divorce harder, rather than weakening marriage further by putting same-sex marriage on the same level. Now, before I move on to the last point here, I want to point out that sometimes the objection, why are you singling out homosexuality, is brought up, and we need to answer it. First of all, I don't speak on homosexuality a lot. I'm speaking about other issues all the time. But this is an issue we need to speak out on. They say, why don't you speak against adultery? Or why don't you speak against divorce? Or why don't you speak against some of these other things? Theft, Enron, all these things. Well, we do speak against those. But there's a big, major difference between those issues and this issue. What's the major difference? Yeah, no one's trying to make the others and trying to promote the others to the government. In other words, there's not an adultery movement out there, right? There's not a big divorce movement out there. Although a lot of people get divorced, most people think it's a tragedy. There are not people out there trying to legalize theft. But there are people out there who are trying to say that same-sex marriage is not only something the government ought to allow, it ought to promote. I mean, we're not the ones who brought this issue to the table. The homosexual activists are. Now, let me just point out some questions you can ask. You probably can't remember, I can't remember all these answers to these objections, so just here's a few questions you can ask when it comes to this issue. You might ask a question like this: are all kinds of sexual contact the same? Is sexual contact ever unhealthy and or unloving? Well, yes, of course. All these questions get at an objection they bring up. How about, are people ever born with conditions that are not normal and sometimes harmful? Yes. Everybody knows that. So why are you saying that your condition, even if you were born with it, is something that we ought to endorse? How about, is there any difference between sexual desires, which is sometimes called orientation, and sexual behavior? You seem to try and conflate the two. You try and say because you have the desire, therefore you ought to do the behavior. You ought to have the behavior. Why? How about, should people act on every desire they have? Question we brought up before. Must the government recognize every desire people have as a right? Because you have a desire, does the government have to make it a right and endorse it and give financial benefits to it? Are children usually better off with a mom and a dad, or is parenting irrelevant to their development? Ask the question, what are they going to say? If they try and tell you that two men can do just as good a job as two women, you know they're denying the truth. Men are not the same as women, and women are not the same as men. If they say they are, then say, well, then why don't you just pick someone from the opposite sex if we're all equal for your sexual partner? Why are you even involved in same-sex relationships then? If men and women are interchangeable, why don't you just pick a woman and stop all this political fighting? If you're a man. If you're a woman, why don't you just pick a man if they're interchangeable? Because you know they're not interchangeable. That's why you want to sleep with somebody of the same sex, because you know they're different from somebody of the opposite sex. So, when it comes to parenting, kids are just going to have to put up with what we give them, but when it comes to your sexual relationships, you got to get who you need to get, right? You can see why this whole argument that they bring up has nothing to do with parenting. They don't care about the kids here. Children are going to be treated as trophies. What is a child going to do to his homosexual relationship? Validate it. We have kids now just like you. What's more beneficial to a society, endorsing homosexuality or endorsing good parenting? You cannot endorse both. That's what David Blankenhorn said in his book, The Future of Marriage. He said, look, I'm pro-gay and all this, but we cannot endorse same-sex marriage because it means that we will be degrading parenting. We can't do it. Parenting's too important. Should the government endorse harmful behavior if it doesn't get a harmful result 5% of the time? That's the exception argument. Well, I see this couple over here, they're doing fine. Should we endorse that? 95% of the time we get a bad result, but 5% of the time the result isn't as bad, so we should endorse it? Is that what you're saying? How about, is there any difference between religion and morality? Yes. Religion, our duty to God. Morality, our duty to one another. Nobody's telling you how, when, where, if to worship. We don't care whether you believe in God or not. Well, we do care. But we're not going to try and force that on you, as Robin said before. You can't. We're not trying to force that. But we are trying to create laws that benefit society. Our Constitution starts this way. It starts that we, the people, trying to create a more perfect union and for the general welfare. These are the terms used in the first line or so of the Constitution. We do that because we know that the government is designed to protect people from evil. That's what the government's primary purpose is. By the way, if a patient is sick, will giving him another disease help heal him? Normally not. You see, this is the argument. They say, well, you've already blown marriage by divorce. Why don't we just get same-sex marriage in there too? Because by giving marriage another disease, in other words, by making it the equivalent of same-sex marriage, that's not going to help. Let's get rid of the first disease instead of adding another one. Here are the final questions. What is the primary purpose of government? I just mentioned it. What is the primary purpose of government? Ask them. What is the purpose of government? The purpose of government is benefit the people, protect the people from evil. That's the number one role of government. In other words, anarchy would destroy people. We've got to make sure that we have a government that rewards the good and punishes the evil. So the two last questions you can ask are, what would be the effects on society if everyone lived faithfully in traditional marriage? We talked about this last week. What would be the effects on society? We would have none of these social problems we've already talked about. We'd have much lower crime. People would, society anyway, would be in much better shape overall, but question 3 should really nail it home. What would be the effects on society if everyone lived faithfully in same-sex marriage? It would be the end of society. That's one, I mean, if that doesn't sum it up, I don't know what does. You must exalt traditional relationships over same-sex relationships. Have to. Otherwise, society ends. Conclusion. Don't let emotions cloud good reason. Same-sex marriage would not be good for individuals or societies. It will have negative effects on traditional marriage, children, the general public, and homosexuals themselves. However, traditional marriage is beneficial to everyone. It's our national immune system. Therefore, the state should not promote traditional marriage, or should promote traditional marriage and not endorse same-sex marriage or civil unions. Civil unions is still public government endorsement of destructive behavior. The only thing necessary for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing, as Edmund Burke said. Christians have been doing nothing on this issue. You don't even have to be a Christian to be against this issue, to be against same-sex marriage. You've got to be somebody of good reason to say, hey, this is not a good thing overall. So we need to do something. Here are the web resources I mentioned before, just so you can have them there. All right, folks, thanks for listening. I know it's a tough issue. You really got to pray for people who are involved in it, and pray for yourself, too, because you have issues that you deal with, just like I have issues that I deal with. And so, I mean, pray that we all stay away from sin, not just homosexuals or people involved in homosexuality, but that we stay away from sin as well.